Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Underwater Photography Show. I am Matthew Sullivan.
And I'm Alex Mustard.
And we have another Q&A episode for you guys today. We enjoy doing these, so hopefully you guys enjoy us doing them for you. Please comment below if you have questions that you would like answered on the show. DM us, email us, however you want to get in touch with us. We're happy to answer them, and we enjoy doing them. So we have another set today, and first question up is from Adrian. Adrian says, I recently bought beam restrictors. I got a pair of beam restrictors for my CNC YSD3s. I used them in Bonaire and they were great. However, I have one question. When would you use beam restrictors and when would you use flat diffusers for macro?
Okay. Well, I think the quick answer is it depends what type of shots you're trying to take. Beam restrictors are a very useful tool. And I think for certain strobes, they really can transform them. I think there's been a trend in strobes over the last sort of 5 years or so to make them wider and wider and softer, which is great for wide angle. But often that light isn't what you want for macro. And I think beam restrictors have increasingly become a really valuable accessory for strobes. And there are a number being produced commercially, semi-commercially, or by friends. We're using 3D printers in particular, which fit beautifully onto strobes, and they're a very valuable accessory to have. But they're not something that you necessarily want to use all the time for macro. And I think that's why this question is a good one. I would say that if I was going to make a broad division, if I'm diving on a muck diving site, on a site which has got great subjects but not particularly nice backgrounds, and often the animals are uglier or in that environment, I would say that environment is very well suited to restricted lighting that beam restrictors allow you to do. And so in those situations, I would typically dive with beam restrictors on because they allow me to selectively light subjects, to enhance shadows, particularly if I'm using a single strobe with a beam restrictor, it can be a very powerful way to shoot. Whereas if I'm in a more coral reef environment where there's lots of color around subjects, lots of interesting backgrounds, in those situations, I want the backgrounds to be, and I've just been away in Canada, and that was a situation like that. So in that environment, I very much want to light both my subject and my background because my background is so beautiful. And I'm more likely to shoot more open aperture macro and blur my backgrounds out. So that would be the division I make. And actually Canada is a very good example of that, in that on my second week up in Canada, we had a storm in the middle of the week, and it meant that for 2 of the days we had to dive in the bay at God's Pocket, which is packed with life, but it doesn't have the colourful scenery. And I didn't use beam restrictors or my snoot at all on any of the dives out in Browning Pass on the main colourful dive sites when shooting macro out there. Whereas once I got into that bay environment, I used my snoot for 2 dives, I used my beam restrictors on the other dives, and on those dives, those accessories were really valuable to have. So that was kind of on one trip, how suddenly when the diving changed, I changed my technique accordingly. Now, Matt, you're a big user of beam restrictors. So maybe you've got some stuff to add to that, although I did try to be quite comprehensive.
Yeah, you got most of it. I think all I would add is largely it does depend on where you're diving. So especially here locally, if I'm diving the offshore reefs and I'm shooting macro offshore, I'll always use diffusers because most of the subject matter out there, like you said, it can often be in a much more colorful and pleasing environment. And also when I'm diving out there, most of the subjects I'm shooting are, the pretty reef fish and things like that, where I want nice soft light on them or more open apertures, things like that. Whereas if I'm diving inshore at the bridge, most of those animals lend themselves to interesting lighting. They have lots of contrast and textures and things like that, where beam restrictor can be hugely useful in helping you bring that out because it harshens the light a little bit. But also it's not the most aesthetically pleasing environment. So if you can eliminate some of that via lighting, that would be a time when I would definitely recommend using beam restrictors. And I actually have 3D printed sets for every single strobe that I shoot, with the exception of the Isoda ones, which I'm hoping they will actually.
They're too new.
What's that?
They're too new. So
Yeah,
you haven't got
exactly. So I'm hoping they'll have some beam restrictors for those, or if I hang on to them long enough that a friend can 3D print me a set if I can get a strobe in somebody's hands. But I, especially here locally, if I'm doing macro, I almost always at least have a set in my BC pockets just in case, because more often than not, I end up using them.
I think as well, because you look at a lot of land macro pictures as well, particularly because you're interested in herps and that sort of thing, that and a lot of that photography is done with harder lighting
Yeah.
and bringing out textures, and maybe also because you've joked I think before that because you don't see colors so well, you're also
Yes.
drawn to textures. But I
Yeah.
think your photography, your macro photography, you use harder light particularly well.
Yes.
And I
Oh,
would say that my photography is very often more using softer light. So
yeah.
maybe if you follow both of our work and look at our macro photography, you'll see how the shots that a lot of the shots that Matt produces are very much in that more hard light style, and mine are often more in that soft light style. And both have their place. And as a photographer, you should try and include both in your portfolio.
Yeah. I would say because they're so easy to carry around, if you have beam restrictors, just bring them on every macro dive you have because they're easy enough to stuff in a BC pocket. Then if you want to pull them out for a particular subject that you weren't expecting or something, you can just toss them right on and good to go.
I was smiling during that because I was just thinking in Canada how they were not easy to take on and off.
Oh, yeah, true. If you're in cold water, it's
Yeah, they were
easier
on
said
for the
than done.
dive, was my view of them. I
Yeah,
could get
fair
them
enough.
off, but they weren't going back on again.
Yeah. All right, on to our second question. And we've touched on this a little bit in the previous episode, way back in the beginning of this show. But is a slower? This comes. The next two questions both come from Marco. Is a slower flash sync speed of say 1/60th or 1/200th, and that's the max sync speed on the camera, a downside for blackwater photography or underwater photography in general?
I would say in blackwater photography, not really. You haven't got any ambient light. Your only continuous light source is your torch, and chances are that torch is not so bright that it's really going to show up in your pictures at a 1/160th with your aperture closed, working at a relatively low ISO. So I would say in blackwater photography, I don't see this being a big significant issue. Your flash is much faster than that, and that's your light source. Your flash is going to be at least 1/500th to 1/1000th of a second, and that's what's freezing your subject. And in that remaining exposure time, I don't think there's enough continuous light for it to be any sort of issue at all at those things. So for blackwater, no, I don't see that being any issue. In general underwater photography, we're dealing with ambient light, and there are a few times when ambient light can be problematic. If we want to shoot open aperture macro, it can be too strong. If we're shooting wide angle with the sun, again, we want those faster sync speeds to control that. Now, there are good solutions to both of those situations. The first one is for macro photography. If you have a strobe that's capable of high speed sync, you can obviously exceed that 1/160th of a second, and with a high speed sync enabled strobe and flash trigger, you're able to shoot those higher sync speeds, and therefore for open aperture macro, that's absolutely fine. For wide angle, when the sun is too strong, high speed sync doesn't always work because you may already be getting your strobes close to full power, and with high speed sync shooting, your strobe needs to fire multiple times during the exposure, so you can't turn the strobe up too high in HSS modes. However, I don't think shutter speed is that much of an issue or the solution if you have a slow shutter speed camera, slow sync speed camera for wide angle, is actually to invest in your strobes. It's never a bad thing to spend money on strobes, but if you do have a camera that doesn't have a great sync speed for wide angle, then if you buy more powerful strobes, it allows you to work at a lower ISO, and basically then that sync speed becomes less of an issue. So if you have weak strobes and a camera that doesn't have a high sync speed, you can struggle a bit sometimes with wide angle. But if you've got the strobe power, you can just turn the strobes up a bit more, but you can then just work at a low ISO and you'll be absolutely fine. If you're shooting at an ISO of 100 or even lower than that, that shutter speed is nearly always going to be absolutely fine in the underwater world. You just need a lot of strobe power to do so.
Yeah, so I have nothing to add with regards to the Blackwater section. Like you said, no ambient light unless your dive torch is a 25,000 lumen video light. Your torch isn't going to show up in those frames anyway, and I can't imagine most people are doing that. And as for the sync speed with regards to like normal underwater photography in general, we've talked about this before. I rarely shoot anywhere even close to that. My shutter speed's usually under 1/100th of a second, unless I have a very specific need to go faster. And in those cases, like you said, there's workarounds for all of those situations if you need them. And I know you have said this before on this channel. I'm sure I have too. That don't skimp on the strobes if you're going to invest in one thing. That's because you can carry those through however many camera upgrades. So if you have a really good set of strobes, they can last you, and you take care of them, they can last you a long time.
And our final question on this one.
So I've been asked this question several times. I don't know how many times Alex has been asked, but it comes from Marco again. And is there any chance that you two might run a shared workshop someday?
Oh, well, the first thing I'd say is I've actually never, Matt and I have never met.
Yeah.
First of all, I would really like to actually meet Matt. So I'd be very up for this, just the chance to actually get to spend some time together. We obviously speak quite a lot doing these, and we have normal conversations when we're not recording. I would also add, when we're recording, we're just kind of watching the clock and trying to make sure we provide a decent episode, whereas we do have chat between recording episodes when we come online. But it's not the same as meeting in person, and I'd very much like to do that. In terms of teaching a workshop together, the short answer is if that's what people want, we'd definitely do it. I run workshops on my own, and I also run joint workshops. And I have to say, it depends on the venue size, really. I
Yeah.
think if you have a small group and you have multiple teachers, it often doesn't work very well. Whereas when you have a bigger group, having multiple people there leading the workshop is a real benefit for the class. It gives more people time to have one-to-one interactions with you. And at the same time, you can also run parallel sessions where one of you is teaching one thing and one of you is teaching the other. And then people can choose, to learn something different that maybe suits their level or their interests. And then it can become a really positive thing. And for me, if I do whole resort takeovers of quite large dive resorts or particularly big liverboards, then it's really good to do a joint workshop. And obviously, when it's a smaller group, a smaller destination, you can end up with almost too many cooks problem. So, but Matthew would definitely be someone I'd really enjoy running workshops with. And
Thank you.
actually, to give you an insight on why this channel exists, is that one of the reasons that Matthew and I got together to do this was that I felt Matthew was a perfect person to do this because I loved his photography. I thought he was doing really original underwater photography. You're gonna have to cover your cheeks for a bit now.
I know.
I also would read the articles that he wrote about underwater photography, and he was one of the few people I felt was writing articles, particularly reviewing gear, that were objective and insightful. Whereas a lot of stuff you read, it's like, oh well, someone gave me this free gear and it's great. And yeah, it works. All the gear generally works, and it doesn't. You don't buy something and it blows up, and you go, yeah, this is rubbish. It kind of works, but and so I felt he was actually someone who was actually properly analytical and objective about gear and understood why certain features were valuable. And then also Matthew isn't someone who's learn underwater photography by coming through my workshop system or reading stuff I've written and only that. And as a result, he has a really different opinion on lots of things in underwater photography than me. Obviously, where things are correct or not, we tend to agree. But in other areas, we have quite divergent styles. And I think that would be a real benefit to a workshop situation because just the previous answer about the beam restrictors, we both have slightly different approaches to certain problems because we've developed our approaches through different influences, through different experiences. And I think that would really benefit a workshop. Whereas I'm not so keen to run workshops with people who basically I've taught underwater photography to them and then they can repeat what I've taught them. It's the same as me telling you. So I think that would make it a particularly good workshop because of that a different approach, in the same way that this channel was sort of designed, that we had different approaches and different thoughts on things. Matthew's now going to say no, he wouldn't want to.
Well, I'm flattered, and obviously, as we've probably mentioned on this channel, praise makes me very uncomfortable. But I appreciate all the things you said. I'm just bad at accepting it. But it'd be a lot of fun to do, and I think you're right that like for example, I don't know if as of when this comes out, if the Alaska episode has come out yet, but I ran that with a guide who's a friend of mine up there, and he runs workshops topside. So the way it worked was we kind of split, and I would help everybody with their underwater shooting, which realistically nobody needed a whole lot of because we had a good group of experienced shooters, and then he would help everybody with the topside thing. And it ended up working out really well that way. And I think something like that could work. Not that we'd be shooting topside underwater, but two different approaches and being able to have two different voices there teaching. maybe, and like you said, from a different perspective and different style, could work really nicely. Um, and I
So where do
appreciate
you
the fact.
think we should do it then?
Oh, I don't know. You put me on the spot now.
Yeah, well,
I don't. I haven't given that any thought, but it'd be a blast to do. I think, and like you
mm,
said, it'd be nice to actually meet in person.
mm.
And I think a lot of people are surprised when they hear that we actually have not ever met in person. But one of those things that just kind of worked out, and it still seems to be working out. So I'm grateful for that.
I mean, because your love is particularly kind of the unusual marine life. So I think we'd have to do it somewhere where there's cool stuff.
Well, yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
big,
then so it's likely to be more like in the macro portraits realm than it would
yeah,
be in a wide angle realm.
yeah, not necessarily, or like, or even big animals, but not. I wouldn't say that
Yeah, you've
Red
got a lot
Sea,
of shark experience.
Erie, or Raj would be a place like that because I don't have a lot of experience with that kind of thing. But anywhere with cool critters or big animals, I think would
Mm.
be worthwhile.
Yeah. So Marco, keep asking and keep the questions coming, and then we can make it happen. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'd certainly very much enjoy it, and I think it would be a lot of fun. And I think yeah, we could probably record a few episodes as well with audience participation.
Yeah, we have a live studio audience for it.
Yeah.
Um, but anyway, yeah, as like Alex said, thank you guys for asking the questions. It helps us make episodes. There are things that we often don't think to talk about ourselves. So if you guys have more ideas or actual just questions, somehow get in touch with us, whether it's in the comments or DM or email or whatever it happens to be.
I think you also
Um,
get these honest answers because you put me on the spot, and I think I'm
also
more
that,
you sort of get a bit more what I really think rather than what I think I
yeah.
should think on
Yeah,
these
so
episodes.
if people enjoy Alex being totally caught off guard by these questions, send all the questions to me, and then I can surprise him with them on the show. But as always, thank you for the support. Thank you guys for watching, and we will see you guys next time on the Underwater Photography Show.